I would like to begin today by quoting page 407, or from page 407, of the New King James Study Bible published by Thomas Nelson Publishers, which has the following to say about the book of Ruth. The story of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges, a period characterized by extreme spiritual and moral decay in Israel. The beautiful love story of Ruth contrasts strongly with the pervasive depravity of the period, giving a rare glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak era. The story itself reflects ordinary small town and rural life in Israel, specifically around Bethlehem. Details of cultural elements, such as the description of the barley harvest, the mention of the threshing floor, and the events at the city gate add plausibility to the story. It is possible that the story was first circulated in Bethlehem by Naomi and her circle of women friends. Later, the author of Ruth retained some of the lovely feminine touches that grace this story. Some of you may know and have heard from previous messages that the book of Ruth is read annually by Jews for the festival of Pentecost, which, of course, is tomorrow. What I would wish to discuss today, though, is how the book of Ruth and its lovely feminine touches, as the commentator of the Thomas Nelson Bible refers to it, relates to and helps us better understand the meanings of Pentecost and how the book of Ruth and its message applies for us today. After all, we too, like the people in the book of Ruth, live in a period that is known for its pervasive depravity and its general moral bleakness, which I think anyone who is aware of the state of the world can see those qualities in our times. And in particular, I would like to discuss the importance to understanding Ruth and its relevance to us through two themes that are also pervasive in this book, namely that of food and that of emptiness and fullness. Now, the book of Ruth has a lot to say about food. Surprisingly, a lot to say about food, much more than we would expect. We often think of the book of Ruth, when we read it, is as a love story, the love story between Boaz and Ruth. But it's also a love story that is very deeply connected to the physical needs of the people in the story. Indeed, food, its presence, its absence, how it is given, how it is provided, is a means that God uses to communicate how things are going with Israel at the time. And it's a way that the characters within the story deal with their relationships with each other. And if you've never thought about the importance of the communication of food in the book of Ruth, well, today we're going to talk quite a lot about it. It's also important to the book of Ruth that this question of food is also specifically viewed in this book as a feminine matter. Indeed, the thematic drive, the plot of the story of Ruth is driven by the need of Ruth and Naomi for food. That is the real driving point of this story. And this theme starts at the very beginning of the book of Ruth. So let's turn and start here in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. We don't get out of the first verse of Ruth before we realize the importance of food to it. So Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 reads, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land." So again, food from the first verse here. "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So the first chapter, the first verse of Ruth begins with a famine in the house of bread, which is what Bethlehem means, house of bread, that leads a family, Elimelech, and his wife Naomi and his 2 sons. It leads them to leave Israel to go to another area to seek bread for themselves. And the return of the remnants of that family, namely Naomi and Ruth, to Israel, to Bethlehem, occur 5 verses later in Ruth 1, verse 6, when bread has once again returned to Bethlehem. So Ruth 1:6 reads, Then she, that is Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. So again, food, the very basic necessities of life, are what's driving this story, the movements and behavior of these people. And furthermore, the last verse of Ruth chapter 1 gives us an indication of the timing of the book of Ruth, why we're talking about it today. And it too is unsurprisingly also an indirect reference to food. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, we read the following. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. We tend to think of the barley harvest as a sign of the feast of Passover in the days of unleavened bread, which is when this book begins. But again, barley itself is also a reference to food. It's the first crop in the year that was harvested for food. When you knew the barley harvest was in, you knew as a farmer or as a townsperson close to the land that food had arrived, that God had blessed the country, had blessed the land with enough food to survive. And it's interesting, too, that this refers to a return for Ruth. Ruth was a Moabitess. She had never been to Bethlehem before. But her commitment to God, her going to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law to her mother-in-law's hometown, is viewed as a return, even though it's a return to a place she had never been before, something we're thinking about ourselves when we think about God asking us to return, or the return to the kingdom of God, to the city in which we all belong, but which is a city which none of us have yet to see. This importance of food, though, continues on through the rest of the book. And since we're at the end of Ruth chapter 1, let's begin with Ruth chapter 2 and the first 3 verses of Ruth chapter 2. And we will look again at this continuing importance of food to the behavior of Ruth and Naomi. Ruth chapter 2 begins, There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Please let me go into the field and glean heads of grain after him in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Gleaning, or walking around in the field, stooping down to pick up the remnants of what the reapers have gathered before them, is not an easy way to make your living in food. All right, stooping down and picking up grain from the ground is difficult work. But it's the main way that people survived when they didn't have land in ancient Israel. And again, this particular tough form of work is actually related to the Pentecost observance. If you'll keep your place in the book of Ruth, we will be back. Let's turn to Leviticus chapter 23. Because Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22, and its laws about the day of Pentecost specifically refer to how people should behave with regards to gleaning. So Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22 reads as follows. It says, When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Here in this law about Pentecost, where you hear about the offerings of the bread, the loaves of bread, the offerings given to God, included in that is this specific reference to allowing the poor of the land and foreigners, and Ruth was both of these, to allow them an opportunity to work, to glean, so that they might survive. Again, food is at the heart of the meaning of Pentecost. In this aspect of feeding and working for one's food in the difficult work of gleaning allows Boaz, in fact, to show his interest in Ruth, which he does in our next verse. So let's turn back to the book of Ruth, to Ruth chapter 2, verse 14. And we see from here how Boaz indirectly communicates his interest in this stranger, this attractive young stranger who's shown up into town. And he does so, again, with this communication involves food. And this communication is subtle, but it's not subtle enough that Naomi doesn't understand it. And it's this, again, this communication that Boaz engages in through food that helps Naomi and Ruth then figure out the next stage of what to do in the book. So in Ruth chapter 2, verses 14 through 19, we read the following. It says, "Now Boaz said to her, Ruth, at mealtime, 'Come here, eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied, and kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also, let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it so that she may glean, and do not rebuke her.' So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Then she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you.' So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, 'The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz.'" So let us note the way that food relates to this budding romance, unexpected kind of budding romance between Ruth and Boaz. So first, a momentous conversation takes place at mealtime. Boaz speaks to Ruth personally, invites her to dine with him in his household, even though she is a stranger. She's not a part of his household. She's not a part of his workers. And he dines with her, he feeds her. He's a generous enough landowner to give her a meal. And then when he sees her eat the meal, she notices something interesting. He notices that she's keeping back part of the meal. Now, Boaz is an attentive person here, and he notices that here's this woman who's probably pretty hungry, and she's keeping back some of the meal. So he then looks and says, okay, this is a woman who clearly doesn't have enough to eat normally. She's familiar with food scarcity. She's saving up this good meal because she has to feed someone else, namely her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Boaz's response to this is to tell his own reapers. Now, he doesn't embarrass Ruth by being generous to her directly. He's very subtle about it. He goes to his reapers and he says, okay, here's this young woman here. She's feeding her mother-in-law, and they are relatives of mine. I want you to intentionally leave food for her. Don't notice it. Just quietly drop food for her. Let her glean among the sheaves. Let her get as much food as she can possibly get. And don't give her any trouble. Don't rebuke her. Don't correct her if she does something wrong as far as the gleaning. And when Ruth finishes working, and after she's beaten the grain, she ends up with an ephah of finished grain. Like this grain you can actually eat, grain you can mill, grain you can cook. And an ephah, we might not be familiar with what an ephah is, but it's equivalent to a dry bushel or 9 gallons of food. Now, if you went home and you'd been working all day in the field and you brought 9 gallons of food ready to eat, it would be a noticeable amount of food. I mean, that's enough food that Naomi knows that Ruth didn't get this from gleaning the scraps that had been left behind from the reapers. Like, someone had to notice her. Someone had to intentionally be providing food from her. Now, Ruth doesn't appear to be immediately alert to this herself. I mean, she might not know how much she could glean normally. But Naomi did notice. And when Naomi was told who it was that Ruth had been working with, Naomi understood then that Boaz was still providing for her. And she understands that God was providing for her through Boaz. And again, this was all done indirectly. Very few of these conversations were verbal. Boaz's generosity to Ruth was done indirectly, but it was still recognized. And food was the means of communication that was used here. And when we reach the climactic moment of Ruth, where Ruth makes her daring Levirate marriage proposal to Boaz at the beginning of Ruth chapter 3, unsurprisingly, food is an element of this story as well. Ruth chapter 3, verse 1 through 7 reads as follows. It says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you are with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he is finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do.' And she said to her, 'All that you say to me I will do.' So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had instructed her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down." Now, people, a lot of times in the church, we joke that, sleeping at someone's feet is a bad way to propose marriage in general in the church nowadays. But at the time, in this village, again, Ruth, because she was the widow, she had to propose marriage to a kinsman redeemer to do the levirate marriage. So it was a different circumstances there. And it's interesting enough here, again, that this passage deals with food in many forms. He's at the threshing floor, which takes the raw material of the grain and barley that they've been harvesting and turns it into something you can cook and eat. He eats and drinks. He's had a happy meal. His farming is going well. He's had a good crop. He's happy and content, and he goes to sleep. And it's at that moment that Ruth decides to sleep at his feet. And he's quite unaware. Now, Boaz is completely unaware of what these women are plotting and planning. No one has told him. And even if he's quite surprised when he wakes up to find that Ruth is sleeping at his feet, as any of us, I think, would be surprised to have that happen, he communicates his willingness to accept her proposal. And once again, he does so with food. This appears to be one of the ways in which Boaz communicates. As we go down, we drop down to Ruth chapter 3, verse 15. It tells us how he communicates his willingness with food. And he said to Ruth, "Bring the shawl that is on you and hold it." And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So far we've seen that one of the feminine themes it is in Ruth is that the matter of how food communicates so much of the relationships and feelings within the people of Ruth. And these themes, these matters of food, simultaneously express some of the themes of Pentecost, including the unity of brethren in common faith regardless of one's background, and God's communication of his displeasure with Israel's wayward ways through withholding food from them. And even, again, the gifts that God gives us and the gifts that Boaz gives Ruth repeatedly through providing food for her and her mother-in-law. And Ruth communicates her devotion to Naomi through the difficult work of gleaning, which is especially difficult because, first, gleaning is difficult work enough on its own, and as a foreign widow, she's a particularly vulnerable person out working around the village. Boaz, of course, communicates his willingness to provide for Ruth and Naomi through repeatedly and generously providing food for them, as well as, of course, accepting the levirate offerage of marriage from Ruth. And we often say that the way to a man's heart is through his belly. That's a cliche we often use. But here in the book of Ruth, food is a way to the women's heart as well, something we may not expect automatically. And Boaz's repeated willingness to provide for Ruth and Naomi shows his attractiveness as a possible husband because, again, of his ability and interest in providing them with the means of survival. And this leads us to our second theme, namely the emptiness and fullness of Ruth and how it relates to the book of Ruth and Pentecost. We've already commented on emptiness and fullness with regards to eating one's empty and full bellies, but it also relates to relationships and community. And let's begin again. Let's return to Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and we will see that emptiness is something that the book of Ruth begins with. Ruth's concerns begin with this emptiness, solitude, widowhood, being bereft. So in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, we read the following. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land of Israel. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the children of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Here in the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth, Naomi loses everything. She's gone to a foreign land because Bethlehem didn't have any food. She goes with her husband, her 2 sons. First, her husband dies. Her 2 sons marry local girls. It's unclear how Naomi may have felt about this. Most of the time in the Bible, we may not assume they would have been immediately happy about their sons choosing foreign women to marry instead of marrying nice girls at home. But their sons die, and so now Naomi is left a lonely widow with 2 daughters-in-law, and that's it. Those are the only family she has left. No physical family, just her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law and herself. And Naomi's reply to this emptiness is interesting. So first she seeks to discourage her widowed daughters-in-law to go along with her. And then once Ruth expresses her devotion, Naomi more or less ignores it. So Naomi returns to Bethlehem in verses 19 through 21 of Ruth 1. So let's turn there and let's see how it is that Naomi feels about how life has handed her, the situations life has handed her, the situation that she's in. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 19 through 21, we read, "Now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?' But she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why then do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?'" Interestingly enough, this reference to Naomi calling herself Mara is also a reference to the timing of this book, again, relating to the period between Passover and the day of Pentecost. Let's hold our place here in Ruth and look at Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 through 25. Here in Exodus 15, we read of a story where the word Mara appears during this period before Pentecost. And it relates to this feeling on the part of Israel that God had afflicted them, just like Naomi had felt that God had afflicted her. She hasn't come to the end of the story. She hasn't seen the happy ending yet. So at this moment in Ruth 1, at the end of Ruth 1, she feels afflicted and bereft and empty. And in Exodus 15, verses 22 through 25, we read the following account of the children of Israel at the waters of Marah. And it reads, "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they had come to Marah," here again this word Marah, "they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. And, just as was the case with the bitter waters of Marah, God would turn Naomi's bitterness into sweetness as well." It is through Ruth and Boaz that Naomi finds fullness and is able to overcome her bitterness. We find this in one of the closing passages in the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Here, at the end of the book of Ruth, we find out how it was that Naomi found fullness, found joy, through the generous birth of Ruth's firstborn son with Boaz named Obed. And we read the following in Ruth 4, verses 13 through 17. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also, the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son born to Naomi." And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Even though Naomi was not technically a blood relation to the child, she was nourished by the fact that she was connected to new life, that she had helped bring into the world through bringing Ruth and Boaz together. In many ways, Ruth can be compared to a romance novel, if you're fond of romance novels. We have a poor but virtuous heroine who is a widow, and we have a wealthy but somewhat shy and timid romantic hero in Boaz. And they are brought together sweetly through Boaz's implicit communication through food, as we've seen, and then Ruth's request for levirate marriage, which frees Boaz to be active in securing Ruth's hand for himself through subtly dealing with a closer relative. We won't get into that story. We'll leave that for somebody else if they want to cover that. It's these elements of romance in the story, this reliance on indirect communication for so much of the action that takes place in the book, and in the stories we have about the communication between Ruth and Naomi and the various women of the town, that led the commentator of the Nelson Study Bible to think of the delicate female touches of the book of Ruth. Yet these delicate feminine touches also relate strongly to the themes of Pentecost. It's through the marriage of Ruth, first to Mahlon and then to Boaz, that brought a Moabite young woman into belonging into the tribe of Judah and into eventually the lineage of King David and Jesus Christ. It's Boaz's generosity to Ruth and Ruth's proposal to Boaz that led to the happy ending that the book provides, something that's not only romance for Ruth and Boaz, but also a connection between Ruth and the people of God. And what's more in keeping with the themes of God's generosity in providing his law and spirit on Pentecost than that?
Well, brethren, do you remember when you came into the church? Did you have any problems with your conversion from the old way of your life to this new one, different one? I remember when I seek God, wanting to follow and worship him correctly. I stopped following Christmas and Easter when I was about 13. I did attend a Baptist church with friends for a short while when I was living in Eastern Washington. After a few attendances, I just felt like I didn't belong. I wanted to know about God, not just hear about him. It was an eye-opener, learning about the Sabbath, how to properly observe it, attend Sabbath services. And then the curveball came, learning about the holy days and unclean foods. But you know, brethren, not only did I not have an issue with observing the Sabbath, I also found myself following clean foods and the holy days. It just made sense. I felt like a Gentile wanting to convert. There were similar Gentiles in the New Testament that Paul and the other apostles dealt with. Have you heard of such of a Gentile group called the God-fearers? Who were they? I'm going to address 4 main points to demonstrate that God's law, especially like we have an upcoming tomorrow, his holy days and the Sabbath and unclean foods were not only applicable to the Jews, but also to the Gentile converts. So the points are, 1, to whom does God's law apply to? Number two, who were these Christians, these God-fearers? Three, we'll observe and look at who these God-fearers are. And four, did these Gentile God-fearers follow these Jewish observances, like the holy days and the Sabbath? So first, let's get a basic understanding of God's law, holy days, and Sabbath, and who they were applied to. So for my first point, whom does God's laws apply to? Well, let's start with the first example in Exodus 12. So we begin in Exodus 12, around verses 43. In Exodus 12, this is just after the Exodus had begun of God's people from Egypt. It was after the institution of the Passover, and God also set forth the ordinance of the Passover of who can be part of it. But look who else went with God's people. Exodus 12, verses 43 through 49. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No outsiders shall eat it. But every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside of the house, nor shall you break one of his bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger sojourns with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you." God is allowing a sojourner to participate in the Passover. But there's a caveat. If they don't want to convert, then they are released to go back to their own family or wherever they came from. When it speaks of a sojourner or a hired servant, as in verse 45, they are temporary residents. That's the reason they are not to be part of the Passover ceremony. They're temporary. But if the sojourner stranger is willing to be circumcised, to be converted to God's way of life, like his chosen people, then they can be part of the Passover or holy days. In other words, this sojourner or stranger is permanently accepted as one in God's family. They too are expected yet to obey God's commandments and statutes. They're not exempted. Why? Because they are now in God's house, under his rules. Sounds familiar for parents, doesn't it? I remember telling my kids, when they say, "This is my bedroom or my room," I said, "Well, it's my house and my rules." We have all gone through that, haven't we, as parents? So now let's look briefly at God's law that specifies we are commanded to follow in Deuteronomy. So let's jump to Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4. People were becoming disobedient and rebellious. God was getting tired of it and sent Moses to address them and get their attitude straightened out. He was doing this by telling them to pay attention and adhere to these commands. Deuteronomy 4, verses 1 and 2. "Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I teach you to observe, that you may live, and go in and possess the land which the Lord God your fathers has given you. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take anything from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." And dropping down to verse 5. "Surely I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them, For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near it, as the Lord your God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that such statutes and righteous judgments are in all this law, which I set before you this day? This is what God wanted from his people, his followers, a commitment. So let's ask ourselves, what is this law? What is the law? Well, merely they're guidelines to properly worship and honor God, of course, given by God. Because the law of God proceeds from the nature of God himself. It stands forever. So why does it stand forever? Because God himself is unchangeable. And what did Christ himself say about the law? I did not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. So yes, these laws not only apply to God's people, but those that are strangers, sojourners, converts, and Gentiles together are to follow and worship God together, same way. So how does everyone do this? By everyone following the same ordinances, the same statutes, and the same laws. There are no favors for each group. There's no adjustments. There's no special exemptions, but fairness to all. We can thus say that God's laws are applicable to everyone. God is setting a level playing field, if you will, for everyone. Point number 2. Who were these Christians mentioned in the book of Acts? It's understood that these first Christians were Jewish. And what did they observe? Well, the law of the Torah and observance of the holy days, the Sabbath, and clean foods, to name a few. It is shown in John's gospel that even Christ and his family kept the law and holy days. It's interesting to think that it wasn't the apostles, the disciples, or even the local Jews trying to convert to the ways of the Gentiles. Wouldn't make any sense, would it? Convert to that pagan world. But interesting is that these Gentiles were converting to the ways of the Jewish sect known as Christians. So now for my point 3, who were these converted Gentiles known as God-fearers? They are non-Jews who, for some reason or another, were attracted to this Christian movement, this Christian form of Judaism. They also worship in the synagogue with the Jewish people. So here's an example found in Acts. So let's go to the New Testament, Acts chapter 10. First couple verses there in Acts. Since Cornelius is a Latin name, interpreters suppose that he is a Gentile. He may have heard about or known about the apostles and their teachings of Christ. So looking at Acts 10, verses 1 and 2, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment, a devout man and one who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. Notice that it was with all his family. It seems that he even instructed his family and exerted his influence to train them to do what? Fear God. Even though this group renounced idolatry, those chose not to undergo the ritual of conversion known as circumcision. They were not exactly pagans anymore, but they were not exactly Jews either. Many of these God-fearing Gentiles who may have followed Greek and Roman traditions wanted to change and believe in this new message the apostles was teaching from Christ. But they didn't like more of the traditions and rituals that they had to follow, like that of the Jewish sect known as, of course, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These Gentile converts seen these teachers, these rabbis, these Pharisees, how they taught, what they taught. Apparently they didn't like it. But when they saw the teachings of the apostles through Christ, kind of got their attention. These Gentiles, converts, were not stupid. These rituals were more of a burden to them since they had been following something similar from their own past upbringing, from the pagan world. They had all kinds of traditions themselves. One of the rituals, of course, they did not like to perform for obvious reasons is what Galatians is all about and why Paul brought it up in 1 Corinthians. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let's see what Paul had to say. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It was when a local group of Judaizers claimed that for these God-fearers to inherit the kingdom of God, or salvation, they had to go through this circumcision ritual. But Paul pointed out that these God-fearers did not have to go through that painful process. There was also the other side of the story. Those who were already Judaizers or fully Jews may have had a change of mind and wanted to follow Christ themselves. So if they understood Paul correctly, they wanted to reverse their circumcisions that they received since birth. But wait a minute, sure don't want to do that. So 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 through 19. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Paul's main point is don't fret of what has already been done, but follow God and keep his commandments. From the New English Translation Commentary says this: these Gentiles who believed in God attended the synagogue and followed the Mosaic law to some extent, but stopped short of undergoing circumcision. It is probably more likely, however, that these Gentiles were still in the category commonly called God-fearers without being full technical proselytes to Judaism. Gentiles are also obligated to God's Torah, or the law, but not to those particular aspects of it which define a person as Jewish, such as circumcision. The New English Translation Commentary looks at 1 Corinthians in a different way. It says, Paul mentions that let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision did not mean literally of some kind of surgical reversal. The marks of circumcision simply mean the marks of being Jewish, circumcisions of sons, Torah observance, the Sabbath, Levitical functions, the dietary laws, and the practice of Judaism. In other words, Paul told the Jews, which would include this new Christian group, not to assimilate into a Gentile identity or forsake Torah, or even forsaking their own God-given identity. Continuing with the commentary, The God-fearing Gentile believers in Galatia to whom Paul wrote, just like the Gentile believers in Magnesia to whom Ignatius wrote, were already part of a synagogue environment. Brethren, basically, they were already Sabbatarian. They were already living, for all practical purposes, a Jewish lifestyle. Continuing on with the commentary, biblical Christianity was a sect of Judaism that included both Jewish believers and Gentile God-fearers, both with their respective roles. But it was not a separate religion from the rest of Judaism. Ignatius might have had a problem with it. And if you don't know about Ignatius, he was one of the early fathers of the church, right around probably during or just after the time of the Apostle John before he died. I think Ignatius was alive right around the end of the first century, early second century. So Ignatius might have had a problem with it, but Paul had no problem with Gentile believers keeping the Sabbath, the festivals, or the dietary laws. There's a book I've read. It's called The Holy Epistle to the Galatians by D. Thomas Lancaster from 2011. These Gentile God-fearers probably suffered from the Roman community around them. Roman law required them to participate in idolatry, to worship the emperor, and to pay homage to the gods of Rome. Refusing to do so was a crime called atheism. If you did not, you could be arrested. The Romans allowed worship whichever gods they preferred so long as they fulfilled the civic duty, showed up at the temple for the proper Roman feast, and participated in a few routine rituals. Sounds like a lot for these Gentile, doesn't it? Roman subjects were expected to bow down to the emperor once a year and bring a token sacrifice. Strong expectations of social conformity governed and ordered Roman society. The only legal way to avoid worshiping idols by Roman law was by conversion to Judaism. Judaism at that time was a legal religion. Jewish people were exempt from civic idolatry. That's probably why some of the Gentile converts liked the Christian movement that the apostles was following or presenting. That option must have been extremely attractive to the God-fearing Gentiles who were suffering persecution on some level from the pagan world around them. So such persecution may also include from their neighbors and even family members too. Some of us may have even experienced that ourselves from our own family members. This is why Paul, a Jew himself, during his persecution, was defending his and other Christian followers, including these God-fearers, of the protection rights under Roman law that is accorded the Jews. That's why to Rome, they looked very similar between Pharisees and Christians. Baptism could have been the identifying trade or mark for these Christians as circumcision was for the Jews, Judaizers, and the proselytes. So these God-fearers took the baptism ritual to be accepted rather than the painful circumcision as an identifying mark of this Christian sect of Judaism. If these God-fearers were willing to accept such a ritual as baptism, then it would not be a problem for them to accept the Sabbath and, like tomorrow, holy days observance, or even the dietary laws as well. It shows then that these God-fearers worshiped and observed the same things as their Jewish brethren. That book I just mentioned, I pointed out some flaws in it from the author. From this main point I kind of went over is from a Messianic Jewish perspective. They like these identifying marks. They still feel like they're chosen God's people. So from the other parts of his book, he says that any Gentile converts worshiping holy days and Sabbath and stuff, but did not have a problem with the Gentile converts eating unclean food. And to me, that didn't make any sense, because if you sit down at the table, you're going to offend your own brethren, because they like to reserve that mark of their, like circumcision was at that time, that the holy days and the not eating unclean food was their identifying markers. Any Gentile converts, well, except the baptism part, then you can eat unclean food. I had to reread that a couple of times because it just didn't make any sense, trying to justify the Jewish perspective. So some of those things you have to be careful on some of these, even from the Messianic Jewish perspective. So my last point, number 4. Did these Gentile God-fearers keep the holy days, Sabbath, and clean foods? But what we've reviewed so far, it certainly appears they not only were willing to follow the examples of the apostles' teachings of Christ, but that maybe they felt they should. So let's turn to Acts. Acts chapter 13. Starting with verses 14. Acts 13. Here in Acts 13 is one of the strongest scriptures with the mentioning of these God-fearers keeping the Sabbath along with the Jewish brethren. And if such the case, there would be no problem keeping the festivals and the holy days as well. Acts 13, verses 14 through 16. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch and Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. Then Paul stood up, and motioning with his hand, said, Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. Dropping down to verse 26. Men and brethren, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear God, to you the word of this salvation has been sent. For those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not know him, nor even the voices of the prophets which are read every Sabbath, have fulfilled them in condemning him. And then it goes on with Paul's speech. Then let's finish up in verses 42 through 44. And when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. So apparently right there, these Gentile converts was attending Sabbath services. Now, when the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. And the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. So we see here that not only the local Jews and proselytes who were fully converted Gentiles followed the Jewish ways, but also these God-fearers. Where Paul speaks of eating anything sold in the marketplace or eating whatever is served to you without asking questions, when an unbeliever invites him to dinner, we can detect that the meat was clean. The issue may have been that the meat was not processed properly based on the Levitical purity standards. Paul explains to the Corinthians that such meat may have been ritually prepared for sacrifice to demons, which one should not participate in. It's kind of hard not to eat even clean food during that time period. As Mr. Albright pointed out in Ruth, probably famine going on during that time period as well with the apostles. So if scarce food was not around, it's time of survival. This food could have been used in pagan idol feasts, which of course would insult God. That's what Paul was pointing out. You have to be careful with the purpose. I also found it interesting from a book by Jonathan Reed. He's an archaeologist and an author of the HarperCollins Visual Guide to the New Testament from 2007, he mentioned that animal bones found at various sites in Jerusalem during the times of the apostles and disciples were not of swine or unclean meats. Another reason why Gentile converts did not have an issue of not eating unclean foods or meats. The Jerusalem Council addressed 4 issues during what the God-fearing Gentiles should do or observe. We remember some of these. The way food is strangled for sacrifice, food offered to idols that may cause an insult to the brethren, blood that may not have been properly drained, sexual immorality. The basic food issue was for them to abstain from how the meat was being prepared. Let's point out in Acts 15. Essentially, these Gentile, God-fearing converts had to give up their former pagan worship practices and rituals. And I'm sure they didn't want to start up these new rituals that these Pharisees was trying to instill. And seeing the teachings of the apostles through Christ, things might have made a little more sense, a little more less burdensome. Why? Because of such acts is insensitive to the Jewish Christian brethren. Notice that the council says nothing about abstaining from holy day observance or no need to observe the Sabbath, not from the words of Paul. I remember many years ago, many years ago, my next door neighbors, they were devout Mormons. Of course, they do not taste, touch, or drink anything alcoholic. But can you imagine the reaction if they invited me over, which they have, they invited me over for dinner or lunch, I think it was, because one of the brothers I went to school with invited me over to their home or the church, a place of privacy and sanctuary for them, and I brought with me a 6-pack of beer or a bottle of wine. Can you imagine their reaction? Yeah. Well, similarly, how about these God-fearers bringing and eating swine at the fellowship table with their Jewish Christian brethren, the apostles, the disciples, even Christ himself? Can you imagine the reaction from the apostles, the disciples, or even our Lord and Savior? So we see that God's laws were meant to be observed by all mankind and not just the Israelites or Jews. These Gentile converts to Christianity, known as God-fearers, followed and kept the law of clean foods, holy day observance, and Sabbaths as were commanded. And I can relate to that. Coming in from outside at late age of my late 20s, coming into the church and learning and picking up all of this. Like the original Christians and apostles of which Paul himself said, to imitate him as he imitated Christ. These God-fearers gathered together with their Jewish Christian brethren to worship God by following his examples and his commands.